Hello and welcome to today's virtual Hinckley Forum. The Hinckley Institute of Politics is a nonpartisan institute at the University of Utah. The Hinckley provides an array of transformative experiences for students through internships, forums, and classes. Hinckley Forums seek to foster public discourse and civil debate on the most current and pressing issues, bringing in local, national, and international thought leaders. We would like to thank our media sponsor, KCPW, for recording and rebroadcasting our forums as part of the Hinckley Radio Hour. Today's forum is the Census and Utah, the power of being counted. We are joined by panelist Mallory Bateman, Senior Analyst and State Data Center Coordinator for the Kelsey Gardner Policy Institute, Phil Dean, Public Finance Senior Research Fellow for the Kelsey Gardner Policy Institute, Jake Fidesimanu, Council Member for West Valley City, Pat Jones, member of Utah's Independent Redistricting Commission and CEO of Women's Leadership Institute. If you have any questions, please enter them in the YouTube chat. And with that, I will turn the time over to Mallory Bateman.
Thanks, Anne, for that introduction, and thanks to the Hinckley Institute for hosting this today. Really excited to get into some questions with our panelists in a few minutes, but since everyone maybe hasn't been following the census like I have, maybe it's not the top item in your news feed. I was going to provide a little bit of information just to get everyone up to speed, get everyone to the same starting point. So this week is actually a year from Census Day. April 1st, 2020 was Census Day. We were really excited leading up to it. We were going to have a big, state press conference. Many cities and communities and organizations were excited to get out and, reach out to their neighbors, get everyone counted in the right place only once. And then, like everything else, COVID came and kind of stopped everything in its tracks. And so I know many university students maybe went home or left the areas where, they were living during school time. So if you did, and you got a lot of repeat visitors from the Census Bureau, whether sometimes even phone calls, they might have called your parents to see where you were living on April 1st or where you should have been had COVID not occurred. There was a lot of follow-up, and it was a slightly unorthodox approach considering everything we had to deal with. So the decennial census is the largest federal mobilization of workforce other than wartime, so peacetime mobilization. It's a big effort. And in Utah, we were focused on getting everyone counted. Since 2010, it's estimated that we gained just under 500,000 new residents. So that's a lot of Utahns new to the state. Some of them have new characteristics. We've had increasing racial and ethnic diversity. We've had an aging population. And so this provides us a way to kind of get a new benchmark for what our population looks like. The Wasatch Front was kind of the hub of our growth so far that we could track, but then counties like Wasatch County and then down in the St. George area and Provo-Orem metro areas, they all topped national lists for their growth. So we had a lot of high growth areas throughout the state that we really wanted to make sure we got counted. The COVID changes in timing created all kinds of fun impacts. Our rural areas and our areas without traditional addresses had delayed outreach because those were reliant on in-person, dropping something off on a doorstep to get your response in. That made some of our areas look like they were not responding at all, but it's, partially just because they didn't have the information to be able to. There was a concerted outreach effort to tribal areas they had to get, once again, unorthodox to try to work with tribal governments and within health restrictions to get communities counted. And as I mentioned, those college areas are going to be really interesting to see how that all ends up. There were some administrative record kind of matching efforts to try to find all those students that might not have been in dorms living off campus, tracking people down and making sure they're counted where they should have been living had everything stayed normal. This created some fun messaging issues between federal government, local government, community partners. There was some confusion. People weren't always sure what was going on. We did our best to try to navigate all of those communication issues, but that coupled with some legal fun, I guess you could call it, there were some lawsuits about proposed citizenship question. There have been lawsuits now about redistricting data. There's been a lot of legal environment around the 2020 census, and that also created some times where we had to just kind of sit and wait and see what the federal government would tell us that we could tell the community partners. With the changes in administration, a lot of those challenges have gone away, but some of those newer ones around redistricting data have popped up. There have been delays in the release of data. And so that's part of what we'll talk about today, and we'll talk about those community impacts. The new data, if you're wanting to make a new little countdown calendar for the apportionment data, so the one number per state that allocates us our congressional representation, that is supposed to be released by April 30th of this year. And then redistricting data, which provides in-depth racial and ethnic information, but then only gives us 2 age groups, 18 and over and not, is supposed to be issued by September 30th. If you're looking for that detailed data that provides all the insights the decennial census can share with us about race, ethnicity, age, relationships in household, sex, and the tenure, so if you rent or you own, we're not sure when that's coming out. We're hopeful it will be hopefully the end of the year, but could be a fun thing that we get next year. We shall see. So with that, I'm going to start off with a nerdy question. And if you don't have an answer, that's totally fine. Because once again, I know everyone isn't immersed in decennial all the time, but are there any bits of information to the panel? And I'll let's call on Pat first, and then let's go to Jake and Phil. But if anyone is really excited, jump on in with your answer. But are there any bits of information that you were really curious or excited to see from the 2020 census?
Thank you, Mallory. A lot of the comments you made are things that are really of interest to me as well. I know I have survived 2 legislative sessions where we went through the redistricting process, so 2000 and 2010. So this is kind of a refresh for me to be on this commission. I would say one of the more interesting things for me and important things is to understand last time in the 2010 census, which groups were underrepresented in that. And I want to watch and make sure that maybe that's fixed a little bit more than it has been. Those groups being the ones that you've mentioned, people of color, renters, younger men, people who own homes tend to be overrepresented. And so I'm really anxious to see how that works out. And given the growth that Utah has, as you've mentioned, I think a lot of interesting, exciting things will come of that. I think it will bring us more diversity in our state, but there will be some challenges with that as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I think something that I'd be curious and interested to look at would be not just the increased diversification and growing overall proportion of quote unquote minority populations, which we all assume is happening. But I'm interested to see the geographic spread within that state and those particular populations, within the state, and also branching outside of the more urban Wasatch Front areas, and see how that geographic spread is also taking place.
Yeah, and I'd echo what Jake said, just in terms of looking at the geographic spread, looking at the shift generally southward from kind of southern Salt Lake County, northern Utah County, that region for the kind of population center of the state. Also, as then Senator Pat Jones worked on the 2010 redistricting process when I worked for the legislature, and it's that will be really interesting to see how population shifts within the existing districts, and then kind of implications for that going forward as the new redistricting process begins.
It will be very interesting. I'm curious about all of it. So I'm excited for those initial numbers to come out and then get a little more insight. and I'll throw this one out to everyone, and it might not hit you. So if there's nothing, don't worry about it. But did any of the 2020 census news items catch your attention last year? I was watching this stuff because it's my job, and I also think it's really interesting. But did any of them catch your eye? And if so, what were your thoughts on how those issues, those national issues of this huge effort, how they might impact Utahns?
Mallory, one of the things that I've always been interested in is people are really not understanding the importance of this issue. They don't realize there are federal dollars tied to it. That's money in their pocket, services in their neighborhoods and so forth. So I think helping people understand the value and the how it affects their lives personally is extremely important.
Yeah, I would definitely agree. And I would add in terms of news items that kind of caught my attention. I think the former president's rhetoric around asking for citizenship status on the census was definitely one that raised a lot of eyebrows. And also the news about the decision not to implement the combined race format and the more equitable race and ethnicity self-response format. The national advisory committees on the Census Bureau itself, et cetera, had really promoted. And that was definitely a concern when that hit the news, that they weren't going to be using that. Those were sort of the longest, sharpest thorns media-wise that I could think of in regards to your question about impact, because it's, as Pat had mentioned, it's already a very sensitive topic, and anything that we could do to make that more equitable, to make it more accessible, to increase the likelihood that folks would respond and self-respond accurately, especially in terms of race and ethnicity. Those were concerns that I had.
Yeah, I'd echo those comments, and then just want to add, I'm just fascinated about the whole process of collecting this information during a pandemic, right? So it's right at the time where we're kind of in that early period of trying to figure out what's going on with COVID. This is the time when we're trying to do that. And I know there are all these efforts around that, but I think it really makes this a unique decennial census in trying to do it while not spreading the virus.
Well, and to add to that, I remember seeing a headline on an article that said that 4 in 10 of the people would not answer their door, those who had not answered the census, and they wouldn't answer the questions. They wouldn't even open the door for a census worker. So that's concerning.
Yeah, and cheers to any enumerators out there who did try to get out and knock on doors and do that outreach. That had to be very challenging for you. I tried to sign up and just couldn't get my act together. and then everything happened, and I was like, this is, it's a big undertaking. It's scary enough to talk to strangers, but then when you have this added health issue, it creates a new level. Jake, I wanted to ask you, I know West Valley had some big plans, some really fun plans for direct outreach to residents. How did you guys adjust with COVID? How did that work? Were you able to reach your community?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, we had a fantastic public facing strategy for a citywide census day, including a celebration or a festival at the cultural center with, the mariachi bands and the food trucks and on-site laptops, so folks could be enumerated right there. Essentially, it all had to go digital, right? I guess not all, but there was definitely this pivot, towards more posts on social media, which all of these things were already in the plan as well. But I think there was just a heightened sense of awareness and more urgency to get a little more creative and innovative in the way that we use social media and the city website. It definitely involved deeper collaboration with West Valley's Complete Count Committee, our local CBOs and advocacy groups and faith-based organizations that were involved in that. and pivoting to from that traditional face-to-face promotional events kind of format to more reliance on very granular outreach, congregation-based outreach, business to business, employer to employee kind of outreach, rather than just doing, the big fun events and the billboards and those type of things that could get a very broad visibility. And so I think we also had to get more collaborative, which was also pretty fun in the end, by doing that virtual census showdown challenge between some municipalities in Salt Lake County and Utah County and some of those type of things. But yeah, that pivot definitely had to happen. It was actually a really great exercise in capacity building and emergency planning. Heaven forbid something like this happen again during another census season. But yeah, we did have big plans. I think that even though we had some adjustments and had to make some pivots, that all of our partners, all of our city staff, all of the folks who were involved, including the West Valley Complete Count Committee, really stepped up to the plate and knocked it out of the park as best as could be done. I think that we have an effort, a very coordinated strategy, and a series of outreach efforts that really were applaudable and really did a great job in getting the word out.
The state had a marketing campaign as well, but then issued some community-based grants, and I got to look at the reports we got back from our community partners on those, and pivoting was kind of the big lesson learned for almost every organization. A lot of our organizations were hoping to get out in their communities and directly work one-on-one. And there were some pretty cool ideas that people came up with on, using social media in new ways, using digital media, or doing, socially distant, safe outreach in some pretty unique ways. Jake, I want to ask another follow-up. So West Valley City has the honor of being the most racially and ethnically diverse city in the state. We have a couple smaller communities that are, have a lot of racial diversity, but there's maybe, a couple hundred people. They're not the size of West Valley City. And with what you mentioned earlier, were there increased concerns about getting everyone counted? And then with the added layer of COVID, did it feel like an extra hurdle on top of what it already was as a hurdle?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. The vibrancy that diversity provides is such an asset, but there are also challenges that we acknowledge in communication campaigns directed to communities that are not homogenous. And so communities that speak various languages, that have varying literacy levels within those languages, not just English, and not just developing impactful messaging to communicate, but then identifying the most effective messengers to deliver that message. That also includes, identifying and including small media outlets and very niche, I never know how to pronounce that word, but very specialized and focused and targeted communication channels in communities that don't have their own radio station or don't have their own television broadcasts, etc. This, as you mentioned, is already challenging in quote unquote normal times. And so to add a level of complexity with trying to keep everyone safe and also trying to promote campaigns and educational efforts around COVID at that same time, that you definitely do have some sense of competing priorities in some communities about, we only have so much face time with our communities. We can't address everything that's going on in these wild times. And so being able to help folks tailor some of those messages into some of the COVID messaging that was already going on, or tailoring census, if they were having an event about financial awareness or real estate, not real estate, but first-time home buyers, that type of thing. Well, how does census data, even though they may not click or may not have that connection at first glance, how does actually making sure that our communities fill out the census actually inform funding that comes to our communities for all of these programs that we benefit and all of these wonderful institutions and infrastructure that we all utilize on a daily basis. And so I would say that, yeah, the challenges were there. It's a good problem to have. And we have some fantastic community partners and experts here in the city who really went, above and beyond to help us address those issues with languages, with literacy level, with trusted messengers, and finding those communication channels that we might not have been aware of because they're just so small and targeted.
Well, I think your outreach efforts and those of other cities, the counties, and organizations helped our self-response at the state level did a little bit. It was a little improved from 2010. So we were about 71% of our households made the top 10 nationally. I know we love when we pop up in those national rankings. And then overall, every state, with the exception of a couple of Gulf states that had those last minute hurricanes right at the end of data collection, the Census Bureau says 99.9% of households were accounted for either through self-response or other follow-up means. So since we believe we have everyone counted, I'm going to pivot over to Pat and ask how the delays in national data releases have impacted the Independent Redistricting Committee efforts for this time around.
Well, I have to first of all say, Jake, that is impressive. You've worked really hard and very creatively. So I know you represent a lot of or the same sorts of efforts by other cities too, but congratulations on what you've done. The Utah Independent Redistricting Commission has not met yet, but that doesn't say that, not to say that they haven't started the wheels moving. The commission is made up of 7 people. Rex Facer, with the BYU professor, was selected by the governor as the chair of this commission. The other 6 are Rob Bishop, former congressman from the 1st District in Utah, Lyle Hilliard, as former state senator for decades in the state Senate. I served with him. He has a wealth of knowledge and experience in this area. Jeff Baker was picked as our nonpartisan meaning that the nonpartisan members had to have no political affiliation on their registration. And so he's from Davis County. I haven't met him yet because we haven't met. And then we have Christine Durham. Of course, everyone knows Christine Durham as the former Chief Justice of the Utah Supreme Court. And then former Utah District Judge William Thorne is the other nonpartisan member of the commission, along with myself. So I feel it's a great honor to be on this commission. We really haven't met yet. I think the plans are that in April, there will be 2 public meetings. There have to be at least 7 over the course of it. And the purpose is to get public information and input from all over the state to find out what people's concerns are, what their preferences are. And then of course, all of that will be coagulated together, homogenized, however you want to say it. But right now, what the chair is doing is getting it up and running and he's making progress on selecting the general legal counsel. They've got those, the job postings out, the Voting Rights Act specific counsel is another person that they're hiring. There's a lot to do in preparation for this, putting up the website, getting that a way that people can read and understand and engage with, and even naming it, what words engage people, make them understand what they're getting onto. So there's still a lot to do in preparation for these meetings. So I have great faith in, so far from the information that I've received from Chair Rex Facer, that he's completely on top of this. And I think we have people on that commission who are ready to engage and to listen and to come up with the best solutions possible. As far as I know, we have to have everything, all of the public input by November 1st, and then we have 2 weeks, November 14th, we have to present the maps. And those maps will need to include the congressional seats and the state Senate seats and the state House seats and the state school board seats. Those are the maps that we will be dealing with.
Well, I'm as a Utahn, I'm glad that we have such a competent group of people that are willing to engage and work together. I think that's really encouraging. You kind of touched on this earlier, Pat, but with the changes in our population, with the growth in our population, kind of what Phil mentioned, you know, the shift to Southern Salt Lake or Utah County. Do you think these changes might provide new opportunities or extra challenges for the redistricting commission in considering all the new data?
I think it will be, of course, it will be both opportunities and challenges, but I think in balancing that out, I think there are more opportunities. I love seeing how our state is changing and morphing. And I think we're seeing that in the fruits of our labor, in that people want to come here. They want to live here. They want to recreate here. They want to go to school here because we have a wonderful state. And I think an inclusive state, the state of Utah. And so I'm excited to see those kinds of changes, even in the rural areas. You know, we're seeing those. I was just in St. George in some meetings last week, and there was I saw this bumper sticker from one person who really wasn't welcoming as much, but just leave Californians, go back home, sort of thing. So you're still going to see that. You're still going to see people that, and I think this is one of our challenges, is helping people understand that people can contribute to our economy and we can be great neighbors. I think on the flip side of this will be the challenge that the commission will have, drawing up the maps and understanding that we have to find maps that are contiguous and reasonably compact. There's specific language that we have to follow. We have to preserve communities of interest, for instance. We have to preserve cores of prior districts. You can't specifically try and marginalize certain political parties or people. So there's a lot to consider when you're drawing the maps. And so that balance of bringing in and considering the concerns that, you know, what's on the minds of our citizens with the legislative language will be a real art. So I think it's important that we have the right people who trust each other, and hopefully that the state, our citizens, our residents will trust us to make the best recommendation. And of course, we are an advisory commission, so we will make the recommendation to the legislature. The legislature will have the final say in voting up or down what we recommend. I hope I got that right, Phil.
Phil, if you have any thoughts on redistricting, you can jump in as well. I was gonna, oh, go ahead. You're unmuted.
Well, I was just gonna say it's Pat's gonna be really busy in October, it sounds like, with getting the data at the end of September and having it to have a recommendation by November 1st. It's redistricting is a challenge, and I am glad that we have people willing to take that on. There's no easy answer on any of it. No matter how you draw the lines, you're dividing something up somewhere to get to equal representation. But I am grateful that both with the commission and in the legislature, we have people willing to take on what is a really, really hard issue.
Jake, is West Valley going to look at local boundaries, like the city council get revisited with this data?
It has been brought up peripherally, hasn't landed on a docket or an agenda discussion item quite yet, but definitely there is buzz around that for sure.
Mallory, may I give one example that I can recall in the last redistricting process when I was in the Senate? So I live in the city of Holiday, and one of the plans that looked like it may go forward was that Holiday would be divided into 3 congressional districts. I didn't find that too acceptable, so I called our mayor and let him know that. He buzzed right up and he said, Pat, can you imagine if I had to deal with 3 Congress people, members of Congress, who for a road, maybe some sort of a road or some other services that we had to deal with. It was then that I realized how important this is on so many different levels. It ended up that where I live in Holiday City, which is part of Salt Lake County, probably the middle of Salt Lake County now, is now in the 4th congressional district. And the 4th congressional district goes from my city, Holiday, clear down through the heartland of Utah County, down the eastern part, down to San Juan County. So it's really interesting. And I think things like that is, were the impetus maybe of people wanting to change that, wanting to have more communities of interest that have similar interests. And so I just think it's important for people to understand why this is important in your everyday life.
That is a very helpful example, and I appreciate it. A colleague and I, a couple of years ago, decided to play around with the data, and we were like, we could redistrict everything. Let's just give it a shot. And when you consider that 75% of our population in the state is in Utah, Salt Lake, Weber, and Davis counties, it makes things very tricky very quickly because you have to split up that giant population mass somehow. And so when we had to try to figure out which cities we were going to split up or what parts of the county, we got a little taste of how tricky this would be. So good luck to the commission. Phil, I'm going to jump over to the budget side. And when we were ramping up and looking to try to make everyone aware of those, more personal impacts with funding, we found that a study showed that, I think it was fiscal year 2017, the federal funding we get from census allocated funding programs was about a quarter of the state budget. And I'm wondering if you could provide some examples of those programs that are those big money items that come from the federal government that consider population, and then maybe on the flip side, smaller programs that are impactful, but maybe hit more targeted areas or focus on rural areas.
Yeah, so I'll start with the big one, which drives almost all of what's going on there, and that's Medicaid. So with Medicaid, the way Medicaid works is a joint federal and state program, and how much the federal government contributes is based on what's called the Federal Medical Assistance Percentage, or sometimes called FMAP. And that FMAP is allocated based on a per capita income measure. So as you're looking at, the numerator and denominator there, this population number makes up the denominator in the per capita income number. And my understanding is that it's updated annually based on census estimates, but the decennial census is kind of the baseline starting point. My understanding is for fiscal 2023, those FMAP percentages will reflect the decennial census numbers. So when you look at the dollars in the state budget, that's about, in this last year, or I guess the coming year, fiscal 22, that will be about $3.5 billion of federal funds coming to the state that are heavily impacted by that. So, if we were undercounted in that, that means our per capita income number would be higher, which means we're going to be contributing more at the state level, and the federal government's going to be contributing less. And that's why it's so important that we get that full amount of population counted in developing that. A lot of the other major programs have shifted away from the decennial census and use other numbers. So even transportation, that, as I understand it, historically used to be much more population driven, now has kind of transitioned to other measures like number of road miles or vehicle miles traveled, things like that. But all that said, there's still various programs, and I think, I'm not 100% sure on this, but I think there are also even some of the smaller buckets of transportation money that are allocated essentially based on population density. And so that's part of why it's important, again, especially in some of the rural areas where the exact count on a statewide basis, it's not determining what's happening with our congressional apportionment or anything like that, but it is driving significant impacts. If you look at it in the grand scheme of things, it might not be big from a state standpoint, but some of these local programs do represent sizable amounts for some of these rural areas.
I'll throw out that the Census Bureau conducts the post-enumeration survey as a check on themselves to try to get that understanding of the undercount or overcount of populations. I know they had been out collecting information still recently. They might be wrapping that up soon, but I think they're going to have some kind of metric with that shortly around the time of the apportionment number. So we might get a general understanding of if things are off. That's our first little glimpse, but the Census Bureau does have some checks and balances in place to try to make sure that if they did miss people, figure out who they are and where they might have been. Phil, I guess we could kind of get back into the funding. How does the state, outside of the federal funding pots of money, how does the state consider the decennial data? And I'll just throw out the population estimates that the Utah Population Committee produces, as well as the Census Bureau, are all based on that decennial number. So where do population numbers come in when the state is looking at the budget?
Yeah, so I'd say most programs are driven by enrollment numbers in the program itself. So you look at like K-12 education, we're looking at our own internal census, basically, of the number of students attending our school and our K-12 systems. So that drives a lot of that. I'd say one of the biggest ones that is driven by population numbers, and as you mentioned, these are adjusted annually with estimates, but they go back and kind of benchmark against the decennial census. But you look at the allocation of local sales tax that's driven, there's a portion of that that's driven by population. And so it's either, I think in the 1 year, it's the decennial census, but then it's driven after that by updates based on that decennial census. So this is actually one of the interesting things that I'm looking at as we think about the geographic distribution of population. And we're kind of making these estimates in the last census, and I dealt with this when I was a staff member at the legislature in trying to think through things with it. But with this local sales tax, if I remember right, Sandy City had a drop in almost 10,000 people from what was being estimated to the actual decennial census count, which had some pretty significant budget implications for them, that essentially they'd been getting more than their actual population share over time. And so it's first of all, I think a healthy thing to create, to have a new starting point of saying this is reality, and then we're basing future estimates off of that. But it can also create challenges as some of these sizable shifts take place.
Yeah, we talk a lot about growth in our state because we are an overall growth state, but we do have some areas throughout the state that maybe stayed the same or did lose some population, especially in our more rural areas. So it'll be interesting to see how they come out in this decennial data. Phil, I want to ask you about the changing characteristics of our population. I've asked Jake and Pat in their respective spheres, but do you think our changing characteristics of our population will impact what our state budget looks like moving into this decade that we're in?
Yeah, so there are a number of shifts that I do think impact some of it the state budget, and then some, maybe at local level and some at the federal level. So the first just being that we're getting older overall as a population. I know we're all getting older every day, but on average, right, our population is getting older, which has some implications where, you know, to a large extent, many of those programs are funded at the federal level. So you think like Social Security or Medicare funded at the federal level, where we have the K-12 and higher education, kind of those at the younger end. So in some ways that provides, I don't know if it's budget relief necessarily, but it doesn't continue as much of the budget strain that we've seen, say, over the last several decades in terms of K-12 population enrollment growth. Some of that is these demographic waves, you know, from the baby boomers and then their kids and their grandkids. But part of it is, as I understand it, just that that shift is moving us older as a population overall. So that's certainly one aspect of it. I actually think it creates capacity at the state budget level to do more. And that brings me to the second point I want to bring up, just in terms of thinking about, we have a higher share of English language learners. We have concentration of students in poverty in certain areas of the state. And I, again, not speaking for the Institute or anyone else, just speaking for myself, but I think these are some of the opportunities that we have in front of us to use a little bit of that fiscal relief that we're likely to experience to really make a concerted effort to move the needle in some of these areas where I think we've fallen behind a bit.
It's interesting looking at our generational cohorts compared to the nation, and then looking at other states. And we had our baby boom and then millennials that are kind of the boom of the boom. I've got a cat jumping on a table. are a little less pronounced, and we just kind of kept having kids. So it's interesting to see how now we've got decreases in our fertility rate, and how that's going to play out in, 10 years when these kids go into our public education system. I think what you're saying is definitely going to prove true. There's going to be some new opportunities for allocation of funding. It looks like we got a couple audience questions, and one, we don't have any partnership or Census Bureau people on the call, so I don't know if we can address it properly, but are there any cyber security concerns with online census responses in Utah? I have not seen anything about concerns with the online responses. There is a series of blog posts about some of the anomalies that came up in the data, just because all the students moved home, or different populations went to new areas. And I would recommend going to the Census Bureau's website. I think it's Random Samplings is the name of the blog, if you're interested in these kind of more technical questions. And then Pat, I'm not sure if you're the right one to address this question or not, but how do presidential, gubernatorial, House, et cetera, races impact the amount of census responses when they occur in the same year? Or if anyone has any thoughts on that. Just because we had some high profile events going on in 2020. I know from kind of a messaging perspective, both the Census Bureau and the state were well aware that they would be trying to compete with some topics that were going to take up a lot of airspace and bandwidth, and trying to get people's attention, like Jake had mentioned earlier, trying to get people's attention was going to be tricky without COVID because of these big races. And so, at least the entities I could see into their approaches were aware of that and tried to target in different ways. Do any of you have any thoughts on that? I wonder, it would be interesting to see kind of response rates when you do have big events going on, but I can look into that for a blog at Gardner Institute.
Are you asking me?
If you have any thoughts, if you don't, that's a-okay.
Well, I was trying to understand the question, but as I interpret the question, is that a lot of people who are considering either running for re-election or running for a new office are really itching to figure this out. What district will I be in? Will I be in the same district as I was before? I mean, that's always a question. And so the urgency is really big if you're running for office. It's a big deal. And I know that those that are planning to get signatures, I think they have to start that January 1st. Phil, maybe you can help me out there. But there's this whole political process. There's a lot of moving parts to it. And so getting this right and getting it as early as possible will be really important for our political system. Phil or Jake, you might know too.
I don't know the dates offhand.
I was going to say that while I don't have any empirical data to cite directly, it makes sense to me that, national or state leaders who use their pulpit power, not just in election cycles, but just using that pulpit to portray the census in a favorable, beneficial light, can have a positive effect on participation. But I also think that there are ways that those who are running for office or those who are incumbent and currently sitting can definitely impact participation, especially in the way that, for example, the former administration appointed a new census director at a very crucial time in the planning stage, how funding was drastically reduced for non-English language assistance and outreach. And thank goodness our state and our local counties stepped up in quite a big way to provide some of that resource and funding for underserved communities here. But I think again, I don't have any empirical data to back that up, but similarly to what Pat had mentioned, I think that the rhetoric that comes out of campaigns and from sitting administrators and executives can definitely, especially if it hits the media and is portrayed in certain ways, can definitely shed light in a positive or negative way on the census itself, which I assume may have some effects on participation in the general public.
We have another audience question, and it's kind of a big question. There have been a lot of frustrations with Utah's electoral maps in the past. What do you think the likelihood of the legislature accepting the independent commission's maps will be? Put that to anyone but Pat.
I think that's a question that a lot of people have, to be quite candid. But this is the first time we have done this in Utah. And I think the fact that in 2018, the voters voted for this, I think there will be a lot of public scrutiny on the recommendations of the commission. And hopefully they will hold their legislators' feet to the fire to accept this. I know that the original legislation or the intent was to make it so the legislature didn't have to approve it, make it more than an advisory commission. A lot of people wanted that, but I have great respect for our representatives. I have faith in them that they will do the right thing, and I certainly think that people ought to be engaged in this and aware of it. But I have a hunch that they'll hear about it if, in fact, they don't accept those recommendations.
So I just want to follow up, and both Mallory and Pat have talked about this a little bit, but I think sometimes people have the misconception in their minds that there are these like perfect lines that you're going to draw that aren't going to make anybody mad. And I don't think that's reality. I think hopefully like it can be done in a very robust way. But going back to Pat's example for Holiday, right? When you don't divide Holiday up, then you're dividing up West Valley in different ways, or you're dividing up South Jordan in different ways, or you're dividing. So to get to equal representation, if you're not dividing one place up, you're dividing another place up. And obviously the hope is to try to minimize that as much as possible. But just given the equal representation issues, you are dividing other places up. So the people on Holiday maybe are happy because they got to stay together as a community. But then the people somewhere else aren't happy and they're going to complain because their community got divided. And the other piece of it, and it's whether it's for right or wrong, but I know I consistently heard people talk about this, was in the example of Holiday. If it's a road issue, you could have one congressperson advocating for you and really caring about it, or you could have 3 advocating for you and caring about it. And again, in all of these issues, I don't think there's a silver bullet. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'll be proved wrong, and we'll find these perfect lines that everybody's perfectly happy with. But I think it's a messy process just inherently.
I'll also throw out that the redistricting data comes at the census block level. You get different aggregations, but the census blocks are meant to be small. They're meant to represent small populations. Or you could even look at census tracts, and those don't always follow city lines because city lines are a different administrative function than a statistical line. If you want to get really nerdy, we actually at Gardner Institute just put out a fact sheet on census geography because that is the one thing we've gotten from the Census Bureau so far. So if you want an update on what has changed in those granular boundaries, you now have a resource. Go check out that fact sheet. I'll talk slowly just in case any other questions come in on YouTube. But I think we've kind of hit on some big topics that are going to impact us for the rest of the decade that come out of the decennial census. It's not just numbers. The numbers have impact and they represent people. So with that, I think I'll say thank you to Phil and Pat and Jake for your time. And we really appreciate that you were able to join us and share your thoughts today. And thank you to Molly and the Hinckley Institute for setting this up.
Thank you.
Thank you.